title of my lecture is framed as a question. Admittedly, a loaded, even overloaded question. What does it mean to be human in the era of posthumanism and global fascism? It is one of those questions that politely pretends to be a title, but secretly aspires to become a life's work. The scope is undeniably vast. And I chose it quite deliberately. I wanted a question large enough to keep me occupied for quite some time. Indeed, if I were to claim that I could answer it fully in one lecture, you would have every reason to escort me politely but firmly out of this room. No lecture constrained by time can exhaust such a field of inquiry. At best, it can sketch an incomplete map, identify some of the central tensions, and perhaps provoke more questions than it resolves. But every journey, as we know, has to begin somewhere. So let us regard today's lecture not as the last word on the subject, but simply as a modest beginning, an invitation to think together about what it might still mean to be a human at a historical conjuncture that increasingly calls the very category of the human, or what's called anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is human-centeredness, anthropocentrism, into question. Now, before we proceed any further, let me begin with a few epigraphs, intellectual companions, if you will, that have accompanied me while thinking through the questions that lie at the heart of this lecture. The first, perhaps unsurprisingly, comes from Shakespeare. I confess I can't resist beginning there, not least because I'm currently teaching a graduate course at ULAB called The Cultural Construction of Shakespeare. So for better or worse, Shakespeare has become something of an occupational hazard. So here is Hamlet, reflecting on that wonderfully perplexing creature we call the human being. I quote, "What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is the quintessence of this dust? Man delights not me, no woman either." Unquote. So this is Hamlet speaking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Act 2, Scene 2. Perhaps few passages in world literature have celebrated and in the very same breath unsettled the idea of the human with such extraordinary force. Shakespeare elevates the humanity almost to the divine, only to pull the rug from under our feet a moment later. We are at once the paragon of animals and the quintessence of dust. As we will soon see, that paradox lies at the very center of my lecture today. Over 4 centuries later, we are still wrestling with Hamlet's question, although we now do so in a world populated not only by humans, but also by algorithms, artificial intelligence, ecological catastrophe, and resurgent fascisms across much of the world, Bangladesh included, of course. Hamlet, I suspect, would have had plenty to update if he were writing today. So let me turn to a few more voices that continue to shape my own thinking about what it means to be human. My second epigraph is from Rosa Luxemburg. So from a prison cell in 1916, the Marxist revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg offers not a definition of humanity, but an ethic of courage, joy, and solidarity. And I quote, "To be a human being means to joyfully toss your entire life on the giant scales of fate, if it must be so, and at the same time to rejoice in the brightness of every day and the beauty of every cloud. I don't know any recipe that can be written down on how to be a human being. I only know when a person is one." Unquote. Yet another epigraph. Edward Said, whose work has amply benefited me over the years, reminds us why humanism still matters. And I quote Said here, "Humanism is the only, I would go so far as saying that the final resistance we have against the inhuman practices and injustices that disfigure human history," unquote. And finally, the great Native American feminist, novelist, and activist Leslie Marmon Silko, and she offers a reminder, especially worth remembering in an age saturated with digital technology, rather digital delirium and spectacle. So I quote Silko, the only way to get change is not through the courts or, heaven forbid, the politicians, but through a change of human consciousness. Only through the arts, music, poetry, dance, painting, writing can we really reach each other, unquote. Now, taken together, these voices neither speak in unison nor erase their differences, yet they converge on one indispensable insight: to be human is not merely to belong to a biological species. It is to inhabit a social world, to resist domination, to cultivate solidarity, to defend and enact justice, and to imagine otherwise. Now that I have shared with you the constellation of epigraphs that guides my own thinking, bringing into conversation Luxemburg's radical sociality and ethical courage, and Said's democratic, anti-colonial humanism, and Silko's faith in the transformative power of art and, by extension, the humanities, let me turn to the world that both shapes us and is in turn shaped by us. So what kind of world do we inhabit? I realize that's another dangerously large question. If we try to answer it exhaustively this afternoon, the organizers would probably have to cancel dinner and perhaps tomorrow's program as well. So still, every serious inquiry into what it means to be human must begin by asking what kind of world produces, constrains, and enables particular forms of life. My own long-held theoretical contention is that we cannot make much sense of our world unless we pay close attention to the macro structures, the macro systems of power that organize it: capitalism, imperialism, colonialism and neocolonialism, racism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, and other forms and forces of oppression, all profoundly interconnected rather than operating in isolation. But we must also ask another question. What is historically distinctive about our own moment, or for that matter, the contemporary global conjuncture? I would argue that we are witnessing the disturbing resurgence of authoritarian and fascist politics on a global scale. Different countries, of course, have different histories, even differently constituted times and spaces, and different institutional arrangements. Yet, across continents, we increasingly encounter familiar symptoms: militant ultranationalism, racial and religious supremacism, assaults on democratic institutions, attacks on intellectuals and universities and on the humanities within them, the criminalization of dissent, the policing of bodies and borders, ecological devastation, and an ever deepening politics of fear. Global fascism, as I use the term, is not a single regime, but a transnational tendency, a dangerous convergence of authoritarian power, corporate capital, technological surveillance, militarism, and manufactured hatred. Now, nor, I would argue, can we make sense of ourselves without examining those macrostructures I have mentioned. After all, we do not live outside history, society, or power. We live within them. They shape our opportunities and our desires, our identities, our fears, our imaginations, and even our sense of what is possible, our resistances and rebellions included. Whether we recognize it or not, those systems accompany us into the classroom, the workplace, the marketplace, the family, the polling booth, the smartphone, and even the mirror. But at precisely this point, what has come to be known as posthumanism, a theoretical critical framework, interrupts us with a different set of unsettling and necessary questions. Human beings? Question mark. Human beings, only human beings? Are we, after all, the only beings that matter? Or even the only beings that meaningfully participate in the making of this world? Increasingly, post-humanist thinkers, I will return to them in more detail later, invite us to decenter the human and to recognize that we inhabit a densely entangled world populated by animals, plants, rivers, forests, oceans, microbes, algorithms, machines, and technologies, all interacting in complex and often unpredictable ways. The point at its best is not to diminish the human, but to challenge the conceit of human exceptionalism, the comforting fiction that humanity somehow exists outside the web of life. Those are indispensable questions, and we would be intellectually poorer if we ignored them. Yet another danger confronts us today. At precisely the historical moment when post-humanism asks us to decenter the human, global fascism is busy dehumanizing human beings. Refugees, migrants, Palestinians, black communities, indigenous peoples, religious minorities, queer and trans communities, dissidents, and the poor continue to be rendered disposable by systems of domination that decide whose lives matter and whose do not. In other words, before we rush to proclaim the end within quotation marks, or decentering within quotation marks of the human, we must first confront the unfinished political struggle over who has ever been permitted to count as fully human. This, I think, is where Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Franz Fanon, Edward Said, and Leslie Marmon Silko, and even the most compelling strands of post-humanist thought can enter into a productive conversation rather than a sterile opposition. The challenge before us is not to choose between humanism and post-humanism. It is to imagine forms of life that reject both human exceptionalism and the dehumanization of human beings. If today's question is, what does it mean to be human? Another immediately follows, what kinds of social, political, economic, cultural, and ecological arrangements make human and more than human flourishing possible in an age increasingly threatened by global fascism, whose imperialist height is represented today by none other than Donald Trump. But where there is power, there is also resistance. Where there is Trump, there are also anti-Trump movements gathering momentum in various ways. Isn't it heartening I don't know whether you would agree with me on this. Isn't it heartening that history was already made, in some ways at least, on June 24th? Yes, last month, within the belly of the beast called the United States, to use the Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti's metaphor, with New York's Democratic Socialist Mayor Zohran Mamdani's endorsement to helping galvanize a growing movement, a record-breaking 10 socialist candidates stormed to victory across New York. Among them are Palestinian American Aber Kawas, Brad Lander, Claire Valdez, Daria Liza Avila Chevalier, and others. This, I think, is more than an electoral triumph. It is a victory for grassroots organizing, working class solidarity, and the politics of liberation over the politics of fear. Another reminder that when people organize, they tend to win. But let me get back to the question of global fascism itself. By global fascism, I do not mean a simple repetition of the fascisms of the 1920s and 1930s. I mean a transnational constellation of authoritarian politics marked by ultranationalism, racial and religious supremacy, militarism, corporate concentration of power, digital surveillance, anti-intellectualism, attacks on democratic institutions and universities, ecological destruction, and the systematic production of disposable populations. It assumes different forms in different places, but its family resemblance is unmistakable. One of the best books on fascism I have ever read is a relatively recent intervention in fascism studies, the Italian Marxist philosopher Alberto Toscano's 2023 book called Late Fascism. Its subtitle is Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis. As Toscano puts it, I quote Toscano here, Toscano, fascism, like other political phenomena, varies according to its socio-economic context, unquote. In the context of Bangladesh, for example, fascism has its own historically determinate registers, resonances, valences, and vectors. Now, my inquiry calls for further reflections on the questions of both humanism and posthumanism. Let me take up the question of humanism first. Humanism is a term that often provokes suspicion, and understandably so. In certain theory-spouting circles in Bangladesh, as elsewhere, I frequently encounter the view, influenced in part by post-structuralist, postmodern, and even certain postcolonial theories, that humanism is simply exhausted, irredeemably Eurocentric, and therefore best left behind. I think the matter is considerably more complicated. There is not one humanism, but many humanisms. In fact, there are competing genealogies of humanism. There is certainly the familiar Renaissance and Enlightenment tradition of humanism that placed, within quotation marks, man with a capital M, at the center of the universe, a figure imagined more often than not as rational, autonomous, European, white, male, propertied, and implicitly superior both to other peoples and to the rest of nature. That version of humanism was frequently, though variously, pressed into the service of colonial expansion, imperial conquest, and the civilizing mission. Deeply tied, as they all are, to the macrologic and micrologic of capitalism as a decisively global mode of production. But there are other very different traditions. For example, there is a revolutionary humanism that runs through the young Marx, of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 through Amy Césare's anti-colonial poetics and politics and praxis, exemplified as they are in his 1955 groundbreaking, poetically and politically charged theoretical work titled Discourse on Colonialism, through Frantz Fanon's new anti-colonial humanism, as in his last major work, The Wretched of the Earth, through Edward Said's democratic humanism, as in his posthumous 2004 book called Humanism and Democratic Criticism, and through countless struggles for emancipation across the world. This humanism does not celebrate domination. It seeks to abolish it. It does not ask us to become masters of the world, but to transform the social conditions that prevent human flourishing. Nor is such a vision foreign to our own intellectual and cultural tradition. Long before the modern vocabulary of humanism entered South Asia, figures such as Chandidas, Kabir, Guru Nanak, Lalan Shah, and later Kazi Nazrul Islam articulated profoundly human-centered ethical visions rooted not in conquest, but in compassion, equality, and interconnectedness. Consider Lalan's celebrated lines, Manush ভজলে সোনার মানুষ হবি মানুষ ছাড়া খ্যাপারে তুই মূল হারাবি. To worship, within quotation marks, to worship the human here is not to enthrone the isolated individual or proclaim humanity's supremacy over nature. It is to recognize our spiritual and ethical responsibility toward one another and our inseparability from the larger wave of life. This, I would suggest, is a relational rather than possessive humanism, one that resonates in surprising ways with some, if not all, of the most compelling insights of contemporary post-humanist thought. Before I take up the question of post-humanism, I think I would do well to dwell on what already came to be known as anti-humanism. Largely as a critique, anti-humanism emerged especially in the 1960s and 1970s. It staged a critique of the autonomous, sovereign, universal human subject inherited from classical humanism. Think of Jacques Lacan, Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and in different ways, Roland Barthes. The target was not compassion, justice, or emancipation as such. Rather, it was the philosophical fiction of a self-transparent, self-grounding subject standing outside history, language, ideology, and power. Foucault famously declared the death of man, not because he wished to abolish human beings, but because he wanted to show that man, within quotation marks, man itself was a historically produced category rather than an eternal truth. Althusser challenged what he regarded as the humanist marks of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, insisting instead on Marx's mature critique of structures, ideology, and modes of production. Derrida questioned the metaphysical binaries upon which classical humanism has long depended. To this theorist, I'm not crazy about them though. I ain't no post-structuralist, but there are certain insights sometimes I draw on. So in many respects, post-humanism inherits this anti-humanist critiques, yet it also departs from them. If anti-humanism sought to decenter the autonomous human subject, post-humanism extends that critique by asking us to rethink the human's relations, not only to language, ideology, and history, but also to animals, technology, ecology, and the more than human world. Yet anti-humanism also raises a question. If we reject the human altogether, do we risk abandoning one of the most powerful ethical and political vocabularies through which oppressed peoples have historically struggled for dignity, equality, and liberation. Fanon, Césaire, Said, Silko, and countless anti-colonial thinkers did not merely criticize European humanism, they sought to find alternatives to it. Their response was not an anti-humanism as such, but a radically different humanism, a decolonized, emancipatory humanism, if we will. And a decolonized, emancipatory humanism, a version in which I have long been interested, inevitably raises the question of feminism, rather feminisms, to put feminism in the plural, feminism being a broad political project of human emancipation, over-determined and over-determining as it is. So we have what is called feminist humanism. The earliest waves of modern, within quote marks, modern, the earliest waves of modern feminism were, broadly speaking, humanist. Their fundamental claim was very simple. Women are fully human. That may sound obvious today, but historically it was revolutionary. Think of Mary Wollstonecraft and Simone de Beauvoir, just to mention two among others. To put it simply, they demanded equality, education, citizenship, dignity, and freedom. But black feminists like Phyllis Whitley and Sojourner Truth, back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and in the 20th and 21st centuries, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, and Bell Hooks, among others, represented in their own ways insurrectionary rupture with that white feminist tradition by organically securing to the emancipatory project of feminism the very questions of race and racism. And this is still humanism as political struggle. There is then what is called feminist anti-humanism as well. Shamsad, are you getting bored by any chance? Okay, no. Am I doing okay? All right, so feminist anti-humanism, beginning especially in the 1970s and 1980s, many feminists became dissatisfied with classical humanism. They asked, which human are we talking about? The so-called universal human often turned out to be, as I've already pointed out, male, white, bourgeois, heterosexual, European. Here in this particular context, feminist theory, generally speaking, converged with anti-humanism. Think of Lucy Irigaray, Helen Sissou, Judith Butler, the early Donna Haraway. Instead of asking, what is woman? They asked, how is woman historically produced? Gender became performative, relational, discursive. The human subject itself became unstable. So, what then is post-humanism? Broadly speaking, post-humanist thinkers invite us to rethink one of the Enlightenment's stubborn axioms, that the human is an autonomous, rational, self-sufficient, and even exceptional being standing above nature and other forms of life. They remind us that this supposedly universal human has often been imagined as implicitly white, male, Western, able-bodied, and privileged in other ways. Against such assumptions, rather axiomatics, post-humanism argues that human existence is always relational and profoundly entangled with animals, ecosystems, technologies, machines, algorithms, and countless other forms of life and materiality. The point is not to abolish the human, but to question human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism, encouraging us to imagine more ethical and sustainable ways of inhabiting a shared world. This broad intellectual movement has been shaped by a remarkable range of thinkers. Donna Haraway's celebrated Cyborg Manifesto, published in 1985, unsettles conventional boundaries between human and machine, nature and culture. Rosie Braidotti's book, The Posthuman, published in 2013, develops what is called critical posthumanism, grounded in interdependence, relational ethics, and posthuman feminism. In Catherine Haley's, in her book, How We Became Posthuman, published in 1999, examines how cybernetics and digital technologies have transformed our understanding of the human subject into an informational pattern. Francesca Ferrando, in their 2019 book called Philosophical Posthumanism, have advanced a theoretically rich account of posthumanism that challenges anthropocentric thinking, while their latest 2024 book called The Art of Being Human, Who Are We in the 21st Century, asks not simply what posthumanism is, but how we might live it, arguing for an ethics grounded in the profound interconnectedness of humans, non-humans, technology, and the more than human world, developing what they call existential posthumanism. Now, Carrie Wolf's 2019 book called What is Posthumanism already brought posthumanism into productive dialogue with systems theory and animal studies. And then David Rodden's 2015 book, Posthuman Life, Philosophy at the Edge of the Human, finally explores what he calls speculative posthumanism, asking how artificial intelligence and emerging technologies may fundamentally reshape what we mean by the human itself. Despite their important differences, these thinkers share a common concern to move beyond inherited conceptions of the human toward a more relational, interconnected, and ecologically attuned understanding of life. These transformations have also reshaped the humanities themselves. Over the past 2 decades, the emergence of the digital humanities has expanded the ways scholars read, archive, visualize, map, and analyze texts and cultures. Computational methods, artificial intelligence, and digital archives have opened exciting new possibilities for research and teaching. Yet, they also compel us to ask familiar but increasingly urgent questions. Who owns digital technology, digital knowledge? Whose languages and archives become visible? Which histories are preserved and which remain marginalized? In other words, the digital humanities are never merely technical. They are inseparable from questions of power, access, inequality, and what might be called and what has been called by a whole host of theorists, epistemic justice. But the emergence of posthumanism cannot be separated from what many scholars have come to call the Anthropocene, the geological epoch in which human activity has become a planetary force, reshaping climate, biodiversity, oceans, forests, and even the Earth's geological systems. Whether or not one accepts the term uncritically, and many have proposed alternatives, such as the Capitalocene, to emphasize capitalism rather than humanity as the principal, if not the only. As the principal driver, it compels us to confront a sobering reality. Humans are inseparable from the ecological systems on which all life depends. Of course, Capitalocene makes more sense to me. In fact, for this, you might want to check out the Marxist environmental historian Jason W. Moore's great book called Capitalism in the Web of Life, Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital, which just came out last year. And of course, we should also distinguish posthumanism from what has come to be known as transhumanism, another category, transhumanism. But what is transhumanism? Roughly and briefly speaking, it generally embraces technological enhancement. Artificial intelligence again, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, cybernetic augmentation, radical life extension as pathways toward improving or even transcending the human condition. Posthumanism, by contrast, is less concerned with upgrading the human than with questioning the very assumptions about the human that have long structured Western thought. I should point out parenthetically that I'm not merely juxtaposing these developments. I'm rather arguing that they illuminate one another. The Anthropocene, for instance, explains why human exceptionalism has become untenable. Posthumanism critiques that very exceptionalism. Global fascism exposes the continuing politics of dehumanization. Now consider, for example, the rise of artificial intelligence. Artificial AI. I'm not a technophobe, by the way. I have no problem accepting that AI possesses extraordinary potential in certain instances. It can democratize, as some have claimed, access to knowledge, accelerate scientific discovery, facilitate cross-language translation, even improve healthcare, and sometimes help address complex environmental challenges. Yet, have you noticed that I'm using this word yet again and again? So there is this. It is important. Yet, under the prevailing regime of digital capitalism, AI is not simply a technological innovation. It is also a profoundly political and economic one. It increasingly functions as a profit-making apparatus, concentrating wealth in the hands of a few corporations while displacing workers on an unprecedented scale, intensifying surveillance, extracting data, and transforming human experience into a commodity. Further, not only political economically, but also environmentally, AI has its remarkable consequences. Mark what the environmental scientist Lauren E. Bridges has to say in a very recent essay called Environmental Impacts of AI, published on 25th June 2026, last month. I quote Bridges here. AI is lauded as a potential solution to climate change, enabling smart grids, maximizing resource allocations. I'm still quoting, and by the way, I'll quote her at some length. Resource allocations, reducing operational waste, and accelerating material discovery for carbon reduction. Yet AI's potential climate mitigations sit uneasily against AI's extractive and consumptive nature. AI is reliant on environmentally fraught critical materials for hardware, toxic manufacturing processes for chips and servers, and energy and water intensive data centers for data processing, all while contributing to the planet's fastest growing waste stream, e-waste. Electronic waste. Additionally, AI applications are being used to accelerate oil and gas extraction and consumption, ultimately speeding up global carbon emissions production. AI. Equally important is the question of cognition itself. As AI increasingly performs tasks, one associated with memory, interpretation, writing, and critical reasoning, we must ask whether it merely augments human intelligence or also risks reshaping and even diminishing the very cognitive capacities of the human upon which democratic culture, education, and critical citizenship depend. The challenge then Let me put it this way. The challenge then is probably not AI per se, but the social relations of production, to use Marxist term, within which AI is produced, owned, and deployed. These developments, of course, bring us back to the larger political economy within which both AI and the digital humanities now operate. Technologies do not emerge in a social vacuum. They are embedded in historically specific relations of power, ownership, labor, and capital. And now this is a thoroughly Marxist insight. Technology is never autonomous. In a very recent essay called "What Marx Can Tell About Artificial Intelligence Today," that just appeared on July 14th in the magazine called Jacobin, Branko Milanovic, one of our comrades, tells us how Marx's analysis of capitalism's tendency to replace living labor with machines can help shed light on how AI take-up may develop. In any event, here are the points. AI is neither good nor bad. Digital humanities are not inherently emancipatory or oppressive. Transhumanism is not inherently liberatory or dystopian. Their meanings depend upon the historical mode of production and the social relations in which they are embedded. Technologies do not determine history, rather they are themselves shaped by historically specific social relations. The question, therefore, is not simply what technology can do, but who owns it, who controls it, who benefits from it, and under what social relations it operates. Thus, the question remains important: what happens when transhumanist dreams of technological enhancement emerge within societies structured by staggering inequalities? And let me pose another question, one that I would argue post-humanist thought has not always foregrounded with sufficient urgency. What happens when the call to decenter the human historically with the global resurgence of fascism, racism, settler colonialism? Think, for example, of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine, genocide, ongoing genocide, most visibly in the ongoing destruction of Palestinian life, and what I theorized in my 2009 book, The World in Question as Late Monopoly Capitalism. Today's late monopoly capitalism, also called digital capitalism, has even been described in one memorably and extravagantly hyphenated formulation as, are you ready for this? This is quite a hyphenated formulation: tele, techno, electro, mediatic, post-industrial, postmodern, metals and minerals-based hydrocarbon capitalism. Well, Galvara, a system that atomizes, mechanizes, digitalizes, commodifies, and ultimately dehumanizes a human being, reducing them to data, labor power, and marketable commodities in the relentless pursuit of capital accumulation. Can we then afford to speak only of decentering the human when millions of human beings are still being systematically dehumanized, dispossessed, displaced, and in far too many cases exterminated? Before we move beyond the human, must we not first confront the material and political conditions that continue to deny so many people their very humanity? In other words, who gets to become the post-human when so many have not yet been allowed to become fully human under existing social, political, and economic conditions? My point then is not to reject post-humanism, but to historicize it, to ask what the post-human can mean in a world where the struggle against capitalism, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and genocide remains painfully unfinished, where fascism is now imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism pushed to the extremes. Perhaps this task today is not to choose between traditional humanism and post-humanism, but to ask how any post-human ethics can remain ethically and politically credible when millions of human beings are still being are still denied the conditions of being fully human. Here I draw upon insights from two excellent theoretical works, Marxism and Intersectionality, a 2019 book by Ashley J. Berer, and Transgender Marxism, a collection of essays edited by Jules Joanne Gleason and L.O. Rourke that appeared in 2021. My argument then is that the question of the human under fascism can no longer be adequately addressed within the isolated frameworks of classical humanism, posthumanism, transhumanism, or Anthropocene studies. We need instead a dialectical, intersectional, and emancipatory humanism capable of thinking simultaneously about capital accumulation, ecological interdependence, technological transformation, coloniality, and the renewed politics of dehumanization that characterizes our contemporary conjuncture. Now I enter the second and concluding part of my lecture, the July uprising. And this conjuncture is irreducibly global. At once global, less than global, more than global, and indeed glocal. Global and local coming together, glocal. Bangladesh too inhabits this complex historical moment. Our immediate conjuncture is of course marked by the July uprising of 2024, a transformative event that cannot be understood apart from the intertwined realities of fascism and anti-fascist resistance. Allow me then to offer a few reflections on the nature and historical significance of the July uprising from a dialectical, intersectional, and emancipatory humanist perspective. Indeed, the year 2024 emerged as the most significant conjuncture in the political history of Bangladesh since its independence in 1971. On August 5, as you know, we witnessed the fall of Hasina, the longest-serving fascist ruler in the country's history, brought down by what was, in fact, the largest mass uprising Bangladesh has ever seen. Also known as the July uprising, it inaugurated an unprecedented historical moment. For the first time, a politically unaffiliated, student-led movement succeeded in toppling an entrenched fascist autocracy, forcing Sheikh Hasina to flee. Its significance resides not only in its outcome, but also in its form, a decentralized, non-hierarchical movement that attested to the extraordinary creativity, courage, and determination of both the youth and the people. It is true, historically true. The aftermath is a different thing. That's altogether a different issue, which, however, cannot be dissociated from the July uprising itself. Hopefully, I will take up that issue, that question later. Indeed, the uprising was an epic of resistance, what some have aptly metaphorized as a political earthquake that transformed the mundane prose of everyday life into the vibrant poetry of collective struggle, particularly during July and August. It was written with the blood, sweat, and tears of the people themselves as they came together across classes, genders, professions, occupations, political parties, organizations, generations, and communities. Even children, cradled in their mother's arms or perched on their father's shoulders, were visibly present on the streets, embodying the collective spirit of resistance. The costs were staggering. At least 1,400 people were brutally killed, while nearly 20,000 were wounded, many suffering devastating injuries, including the loss of eyes, arms, legs, and other limbs. Those who were murdered came from every walk of life: children, youth, workers, women, the middle-aged, the elderly. A poignant reminder that this uprising belonged to not to any single political organization, but to the people themselves, thousands of whom paid for it with their blood, many with their lives. Its immediate success, however, cannot be understood in isolation. It was rooted in more than 15 years of accumulated struggles, often unsuccessful, yet generative of political consciousness, collective rage, and organizational experience. To grasp the significance of 2024, therefore, requires accounting not only for its radiant singularity, but also for its determinate connections to the past. We must historicize. As Rabindranath Tagore himself reminds us, not that he is always rigorously historical, "O time past, you wander from world to world, continue to work in silence," unquote. And James Baldwin, one of my favorite black writers, puts the matter even more forcefully. And I quote Baldwin here. History is literally present in all that we do, unquote. To speak of 2024 then is also to speak of the political culture that has unfolded since 1972, as well as the long history of people's resistances to that very culture. It would therefore constitute a grave historical injustice. Let me repeat. It would therefore constitute a grave historical injustice, indeed an affront to both our conscience and the people themselves, if such a mass uprising is reduced to a conspiracy, as some would have it, or dismissed it as the handiwork of opposition-linked forces. Such erasures are not interpretations. They're distortions. They erase the agency of the masses themselves. The uprising, of which I was a direct, unrepentant participant, reclaimed the three foundational principles of 1971, equality, justice, and humanity, principles that successive regimes had systematically violated. It also decisively dismantled. Should I say decisively dismantled now? But at that point, it was this understanding, impression, that it dismantled the Awami League's manipulative binary of freedom fighter versus Razakar, exposing both its historical inconsistency and its authoritarian opportunist deployment. It is not for nothing that the anti-discrimination student movement repeatedly declared, and I quote in my translation, "A new Bangladesh will be built." Mark these words. These words are repeated during the uprising from the platform of anti-discrimination student movement. So I quote, "A new Bangladesh will be built through the student-citizen uprising where equality, justice, and human dignity will prevail," unquote. We must hold on to that declaration. To remember is to resist. To forget is to invite defeat. Independence lives in memory. Let us therefore reject the false binary that pits 1971 against 2024. They are not antagonistic moments, but historical echoes, interconnected struggles animated by the same unfinished aspirations. As my favorite African revolutionary, Amilcar Cabral, puts it, claim no easy victories. As I've argued elsewhere, every progressive mass movement remains necessarily incomplete and even paradoxical. Never fully victorious, never entirely defeated. The struggle persists even as powerful domestic and external forces continue attempting to discredit both the emancipatory possibilities opened by 2024 and the unfinished legacy of 1971. What is required now is what I would call again a dialectical intersectional emancipatory humanism. Dialectical because the July uprising can be understood only through its constitutive contradictions, continuity and rupture, victory and incompleteness, memory and becoming. Intersectional because no democratic future can emerge by abstracting the people from the differentiated realities of class, gender, religion, ethnicity, disability, region, sexuality, or generation. And emancipatory because the struggle is not merely against an authoritarian regime, but against every structure of domination, economic, political, cultural, patriarchal, colonial, ecological, and epistemic, that denies the human beings and the diverse forms of life the conditions necessary to flourish. I'm towards the end. Within such a framework, democracy, the question of democracy is very important. Democracy must mean far more than electoral ritual or constitutional formality. It must become the material democratization of everyday life. It must speak first and foremost to those who continue to bear the greatest weight of history: women, workers, poor peasants, religious and ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized communities who together constitute the majority, the overwhelming majority of the people. If you want to talk about the people, let's mean it. Who are the people? You, I, the middle class and the upper class together. If you want to talk about the majority of the people in this country, আমাদেরকে খেটে খাওয়া মানুষের কথা বলতে হবে, তারাই মেজরিটি। তার সাথে যুক্ত করতে হবে নারীদের। বর্তমান সময় আমাদের নারীদের সংখ্যার দিক দিয়েও নারী বেড়ে গেছে, পুরুষের সংখ্যার চেয়ে নারীর সংখ্যা বেশি। সেখানেও সংখ্যাগত দিক যদি ধরি, আর তারপরে তো আমাদের মাইনরিটি আছে যাদের কথা তো কোনো রাজনৈতিক দল তাদের নিজেদের এজেন্ডার মধ্যে রাখে নাই, রাজনীতির মধ্যে রাখে নাই, জনগণকে ধাপ্পা দিয়ে চলেছে। এই চারটা মাইনরিটি সংক্ষেপে বলতে গেলে: রিলিজিয়াস মাইনরিটি, লিঙ্গুইস্টিক মাইনরিটি। বাংলাদেশ কি কেবলমাত্র বাংলা ভাষার মানুষের দেশ? বাংলাদেশ তো এখানে বিহারি আছে, অন্য জাতির ভাষা আছে, বিভিন্ন ভাষার দেশ হচ্ছে বাংলাদেশ। তো সেটা গেল কোথায়? লিঙ্গুইস্টিক মাইনরিটি। আর আরেকটা ethnic minority তো আছেই, including the indigenous peoples, and then you have sexual/gender minority, of which hardly anybody speaks. Gender and /sexual minority, LGBTQA+1. এখন মনে হতে পারে যে আমি খুব ফ্যাশনেবলি বোধহয় কথাটা বলছি, আসলে বাস্তবে তো তারা আমাদের বাংলাদেশে আছেন, তারা আমাদের দেশের নাগরিক। সুতরাং তাদের কথা কোথায়? এই যে জনগণ করে, আমি তো লক্ষ্য করি যে আমরা জনগণের নামে কথা বলি, কর্পোরেশনও জনগণের নামে কথা বলে, রাজনীতিকরা তো অভ্যাসবশত বলে, মধ্যবিত্ত বুদ্ধিজীবী, তথাকথিত বুদ্ধিজীবীরা জনগণের নামে কথা বলে। এবং এই জনগণ এটা একটা ফাঁকা বলি। জনগণ যদি সত্যিকারের মিন করতে হয় তাহলে তো তোমাদের কথার মধ্যে প্রথম আসার দরকার নারী এবং খেটে খাওয়া মানুষ, ওভারওয়েলমিং মেজরিটি। আসবে না, এটা তো যুক্ত একটা কাণ্ডজ্ঞানের ব্যাপার। সেটা তো নাই মাইনরিটি যারা, তাদেরও কথা আসতে হবে। গণতন্ত্র মানে শুধু মেজরিটিকে নিয়ে না, মাইনরিটিকে নিয়ে তাদের অধিকার সংরক্ষণ করা, তাদের কথা সামনে আনা। কিন্তু কোন রাজনৈতিক দল 1972 সাল থেকে আজ পর্যন্ত আপনারা যদি কেউ দেখাতে পারেন আমাকে যে তারা জনগণকে ঠিক এইভাবে ডিফাইন করে জনগণকে আসলে কেন্দ্রিকতা দিয়েছে, আসলে সেটা তো দেয় নাই। তো এগুলো আমাদেরকে, আমরা যেহেতু হিউম্যানিটিজ স্কলার, ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং বলে, এটা বাজওয়ার্ড হয়ে গেছে ভাবে। হ্যাঁ, ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং মানে আমি অন্য কিছু বুঝি। ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিংয়ের একটা ডেফিনেশন হচ্ছে যে আমরা একটা অবজেক্ট বা একটা সাবজেক্টকে নিলাম, তারপর বিভিন্ন দিক থেকে এটাকে দেখলাম, মাল্টিপল পার্সপেক্টিভ। এটা একটা অ্যামালগামেশন। ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং সেখানেই শেষ হলে তো মুশকিল, কারণ ওখানে তো আরেকটা স্টেপ নিতে হবে। কে কথা বলছে, কে ক্ষমতাবান, কে কম ক্ষমতাবান, কার পার্সপেক্টিভ ক্ষমতা থেকে আসছে, কার পার্সপেক্টিভ অক্ষমতা থেকে আসছে। তথাকথিত একাডেমিক অবজেক্টিভিটির নামে আমরা এগুলো খালি এক্সপোজ করতে থাকি, বর্ণনা করতে থাকি। দিস ইজ হোয়াট আই ডোন্ট সাবস্ক্রাইব টু। তো মাই আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং অফ ক্রিটিক্যাল থিঙ্কিং ইজ সার্টেনলি ওয়ে ডিফারেন্ট ফ্রম দ্য আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং অফ দোজ হু mean by critical thinking only this amalgamation or summation of multiple perspectives that they deploy to describe or analyze or anatomize either a subject or an object and so on and so forth. So সেটা একটা আছে। এখন কি দাঁড়াচ্ছে? ডেমোক্রেসি। তাহলে religious ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples, persons with abilities and other marginalized communities who together constitute, as I've already said, overwhelming majority of Bangladesh. Likewise, independence must come to signify not the ornamental sovereignty of a privileged few, but the economic, political, cultural, and intellectual emancipation of that majority. But let us also be clear, no such emancipatory horizon can be realized within a political culture that has remained stubbornly middle-class centric, Dhaka-bound, dynastic. আচ্ছা, আপনারা বলেন যে আমরা যে নতুন বাংলাদেশ করার কথা, এটা কি উঠেছিল না? আমাদের জুলাই গণঅভ্যুত্থানের সময় কি নতুন বাংলাদেশের কথা আমরা বলেছি নতুন বাংলাদেশের কথা। কিন্তু নতুন বাংলাদেশ আপনি কি করে গড়বেন? পুরাতন রাজনীতি দিয়ে। এটা তো কাণ্ডজ্ঞানের ব্যাপার। পুরাতন রাজনীতি কি? এই যে এই পরিবারতান্ত্রিক রাজনীতি, এটা তো পশ্চাৎপদ রাজনীতি। এটা তো পৃথিবীতে তো এটা না বোঝার তো কোনো কারণ নাই। তো আপনি পশ্চাৎপদ রাজনীতি দিয়ে নতুন বাংলাদেশ করবেন, মধ্যপন্থা, এটাও তো পশ্চাৎপদ ক্যাটাগরি। মধ্যপন্থা দিয়ে আপনি কি বাংলাদেশের মধ্যপন্থী দিয়ে কি আপনি নতুন বাংলাদেশ করবেন? এই প্রশ্নগুলো আমাদের ওঠানো উচিত। ক্রিটিক্যাল হিউম্যানিটিসের ছাত্রছাত্রী হিসেবে আমি তো ক্রিটিক্যাল হিউম্যানিটিসের ছাত্র, সুতরাং আমি প্রশ্নগুলো ওঠাতে চাই। এগুলো তো ধাপ্পাবাজির মধ্যে পড়েছে। সুতরাং আমি সেটাই বলবো যে নো সাচ ইমানসিপেটরি হরাইজন ক্যান বি realized within a political culture that has evolved and that has remained stubbornly middle-class centric, Dhaka-bound, dynastic, masculinist, and beholden to money and the market. Indeed, the mainstream ruling class political culture that has evolved between 1972 and now was increasingly marked by what I call the fascisation of politics. That is to say, the commodification and commercialization of politics, the bureaucratization of power, the militarization of governance, the class-driven instrumentalization of religion, and the criminalization of politics itself. Under Sheikh Hasina, this tendency is crystallized in extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, even corporatism, media monopolization, leader fetishism, organized state violence, and pervasive surveillance. To speak of equality, justice, and human dignity under such conditions is to speak in promises perpetually deferred. ফ্যাসিজমের কথা একটু হিস্টোরিসাইজ করতে হবে। ফ্যাসিজমের শুরু আসলে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের সময় থেকে। আমাকে একজন জিজ্ঞাসা করেছিল যে সবচাইতে ক্লাসিক ফ্যাসিস্ট স্টেটমেন্ট বাংলাদেশে উচ্চারিত হয়েছে সেটা কোনটা? ক্লাসিক ফ্যাসিস্ট স্টেটমেন্ট, ওই একটা স্টেটমেন্ট ধরলে বোঝা যায় ফ্যাসিজম কি, অনেকটা বোঝা যায়। সেটা কি আমাদের মনে আছে? কেউ বলতে পারবেন? সেটা হচ্ছে সবাই তোরা বাঙালি হয়ে যা। এটা হচ্ছে ক্লাসিক ফ্যাসিস্ট স্টেটমেন্ট। সবাই বাঙালি হতে হবে কেন? এই দেশের নাগরিক তো অবাঙালি আছে, তাদের কি হবে? আরও মানুষ আছে, তাদের কি হবে? এইটা হচ্ছে ক্লাসিক ফ্যাসিস্ট স্টেটমেন্ট। সো আই হ্যাভ রিটেন অ্যাবাউট দিস অলসো, যে বঙ্গবন্ধু বলি আমরা যাকে, শেখ মুজিবুর রহমান, শেখ মুজিবুর রহমান বাংলাদেশের রাজনৈতিক ইতিহাসে যেটা করেছে সেটা হচ্ছে ফ্যাসিজমের বীজ বপন করে দিয়ে গেছে। তবে বেটি কিন্তু বাপকে টেক্কা দিতে পারে না গণহত্যার বিষয়ে। আপনারা হয়তো অনেকে জানেন না যে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের শাসনামলে, এটা ঐতিহাসিকভাবে সত্য, বদরুদ্দীন ওমর লিখেছেন, আরও কিছু লেখার মধ্যে এসেছে যে একটা গণহত্যা হয়েছিল। প্রায় 30,000, অনেকে বলে আবার 40,000, যে ধরলাম 30,000 মানুষকে হত্যা করা হয়েছে। একটা স্বাধীন দেশে, নিজের দেশে 30,000 মানুষ মৃত্যুবরণ করেছে, হত্যা করা হয়েছে। 30,000 মানুষ, একটা পার্টি ছিল। এটা তো সত্য। তারা যুক্তি দিবে যে ওই সময় থাকতে হবে, এই করতে হবে, সেই করতে হবে, কিন্তু একটা পার্টি ছিল। এবং শুধু তাই না, পেপারে ছিল একটা। এগুলো দুর্ভিক্ষ হয়েছে, সমস্ত কিছু মিলিয়ে। কিন্তু হত্যার কথাটা যদি বলা হয়, এটাকে ধামাচাপা দিয়ে রাখা হয়েছে দীর্ঘ সময় ধরে ইতিহাসের এই বিষয়গুলোকে। আমি শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের অবদানকে কোনোরূপে কখনোই অস্বীকার করি না। বাংলাদেশে মুক্তিযুদ্ধের কথা প্রসঙ্গে এলে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমান তো অবশ্যই উচ্চারিত হবে। তিনি জনগণের স্বীকৃত নেতা ছিলেন, তিনি মোবিলাইজ করতে পারতেন। এবং 1970 সালেও শেখ মুজিবুর রহমান যে পরিমাণ ভালোবাসা পেয়েছিল, এরকম ভালোবাসা রাজনৈতিক বাংলাদেশে, মানে তখনকার পূর্ব পাকিস্তানের ইতিহাসে ওইভাবে অত পায় নাই, এটাও সত্য। কিন্তু শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের অবদানের কথা বলবো, কিন্তু তার অপরাধের কথা বলবো না, এটা তো ঠিক হবে না। আমাকে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানকে সমগ্রে দেখতে হবে। এক অকে আপনি ওপরে নেবেন, মানে ধরেন অবদানটা এমনই মনে হবে যে শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের যেন কোনো ভুল নাই, উনি কখনো ভুল করতে পারেন না। তিনি এমন একজন ফেরেশতা, তিনি কখনোই ভুল করতে পারেন না। তাকে ফেরেশতার স্থানে আপনি তাকে স্থান করে দিলেন। আবার অন্যদিকে আরেকটা আছে, সেটা হচ্ছে অপরাধ। এমন অপরাধ করেছে যে তাকে মনে হয় যে একেবারে শয়তান, কোনো অবদান নাই বাংলাদেশের ইতিহাসে মুছে পাবো। তো অবদান এবং অপরাধের সমগ্রে বিচার করতে হবে। তবে একটা মানুষের অপরাধ এবং অবদানের সমগ্রে বিচার করতে গেলে আরেকটা জিনিস আসে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে তার আগের কাজ এবং পরের কাজ দুটাকে তো তুলনা করতে হয়। আগের কাজ স্বীকার করে নিলেও অনেক সময় দেখা যায় যে পরের কাজগুলো আগের কাজগুলোকে ম্লান করে দিচ্ছে, এটা বলি না আমরা যে আগের কাজ আমরা করেছি একটা, ঠিক আছে, পরের কাজ দেখলাম যে সেটা এমন ভয়াবহ হলো যে আগের কাজকে ম্লান করে দিচ্ছে। এরকম হয় কারণ একটাই আমার কথা হচ্ছে একটাই গণহত্যা হয়েছে। নাম্বার নিয়ে আবার বিতর্ক করবে যে না ওটা তো 25,000 হয়েছে, আরে 25,000 যদি হলে ওটা তো খারাপ। যদি কেউ বলে না না ওটা তো 100 জন ছিল, তাও খারাপ। কিন্তু গণহত্যা হবে কেন? হত্যা হবে কেন? হত্যা হবে কেন? এই একটাই প্রশ্ন। হত্যাকারীকে তো আমরা বঙ্গবন্ধু অনেকে বলে, আমি তো বলা আমার জন্য খুব ডিফিকাল্ট হয়। তো যাই হোক, ডিফিকাল্ট না, আমি বলি না, আসলে কখনোই বলি না, unrepentantly. That said, well, the July uprising therefore ought not to be remembered merely as a spectacular political event or a successful transfer of power. Its deeper significance lies in its ethical and historical invitation to imagine and create a republic grounded not in domination but in solidarity, not in exclusion but in radical inclusiveness, not in privilege but in equality, not in dehumanization but in the continual humanization of society itself. Such humanization is never complete. It is an unfinished historical praxis, renewed through struggle, sustained by memory and animated by hope. The task before us then is not reformist tinkering but radical reorientation, returning independence to the people who made it possible in both 1971 and 2024 and who continue even now to struggle to claim it. That, to my mind, remains the unfinished project of dialectical, intersectional, emancipatory humanism. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me.